Certain naivety creeping into some of the speeches we're hearing from members opposite. On the one hand, they say, don't rush, take this sensibly, take a deliberative approach. And then on the other, they say, you should be going out there because these people are very cunning. They will find every loophole imaginable, going out there and consulting widely. Now, Mr. Chairman, there is an inconsistency in that position of monumental proportions. To suggest that because these people in the synthetic drug industry are cunning and will drive loopholes wherever they can find them, that we should have gone out there and consulted with them about how we develop this legislation. That is clearly absurd. I signalled at the second reading stage of this bill that there would be an amendment coming. It would have been simply daft of me to go out there at that stage, trail it around the country, get every synthetic drug manufacturer in the country working out the way around it. Mr. Chairman, how can the opposition be that naive? Because that is the reality of the situation. We do face a serious problem. I concur with them on that point. But we actually have to have solutions that work. And to some extent, Mr. Robertson is right when he says at the beginning this is going to be a cat and mouse game. I said that yesterday myself, because that's the reality. But we've got to have the tools to do the job. This amendment gives us that capacity. It was interesting watching the reaction of the industry, because they clearly were not expecting an amendment of this type, because this actually does curtail their activities very, very strongly indeed, and that is in line with the public sentiment. That is in line with what we've been seeking to do right from the outset. Now, Mr. Chairman, let me turn to the issue of the methamphetamine campaign. And again, the same naivety applies. We know that a substantial amount of the pseudoephedrine coming into New Zealand to be used as a methamphetamine precursor is coming in illegally across the border through a whole range of subterfuges. We also know that a certain amount was being made available in the way that will now be made illegal by this bill through pharmacies. It was logical to do two things. Firstly, cut off that obvious chain of supply, and that's what this bill does by bringing in this ban. At the same time, secondly, my colleague, the Minister of Customs and the Minister of Police, have dramatically increased the resources available to their departments, and we are starting to see significant increases in seizures of illegal product being made. The change in terms of the outlawing of pseudoephedrine in pharmacies allows us to concentrate more resource on that much more difficult area of targeting the illegal importations. And, Mr. Chairman, that is entirely as it should be in terms of the campaign against this particular objective item. Mr. Chairman, it's worth reporting to the House this fact. I went to the United Nations Convention on Drugs meeting in Vienna in March, and New Zealand was asked to give a presentation there on our methamphetamine campaign because it is seen as world-leading. And we had over 200 delegates from a range of nations, including President Obama's self-named drug czar, other leading officials, the President of the European Commission, come to our session to actually learn what New Zealand is doing in this area and to congratulate us for the initiatives that we're taking. So on the one hand, we are seen by the international community as having a cutting-edge policy. On the other hand, come back to this House and we're seen by the opposition as being too slow, too little, too ineffectual. You cannot have it both ways. I'd far rather take the view of the international experts, the people who are seeking New Zealand's advice on how to deal with this issue, rather than the opposition that's here carping today. Mr. Chairman, this bill does make substantive progress in both orders. And let me make one other point before I sit down. The member who just resumed her seat said, oh, you should have enacted the Law Commission report. The Law Commission's report came out at the end of May. There's about 170 recommendations in it altogether. Some of... excuses, says the member. Action man from the opposition, excuses. I must say that's something... Action is never a charge that would have been laid against the honourable member. 170 recommendations, 45 in this particular area. All of them at a very high level that need to actually be translated into practical decisions in the areas that the government chooses to proceed with. And in some areas, it will not choose to proceed with the Law Commission's recommendations. That is fairly obvious. But they need to be worked through. We need to get the structures in place. We need to get the legislation drafted. And we need to be in a position, Mr. Chairman, to, I'm just anticipating your bell, Mr Chairman, we need to be in a position to put a comprehensive package in place. I have said that from the day the report was tabled. But you cannot sit here and say, therefore, in the interim, we do nothing. We just sit on our hands and wait until that more detailed work is completed and we have a coherent regime to bring to the House. What this amendment does is put in place a regime that the more sane members of the opposition acknowledge is sensible. They welcome it, I heard Mr Lees-Galloway say, in terms of curbing the incidence of synthetic cannabinoids on the market at the moment. And that is as it should be. Now, Mr Chairman, the House faces a couple of choices. It can continue the game of we would be tougher than you or vice versa. It can even take the line that Mr Haig and, curiously, Mrs Roy take of do nothing, just simply let things go. I guess both have never found a drug they don't like. But it actually has the opportunity tonight to put in place a very strong regime and send a clear signal to an industry which everyone has described as disreputable about how we disapprove of its activities. This amendment is comprehensive, deliberately so. It would have been simply naive to go out there and wave it around to the contentment of the industry long before putting it into the House. And, sir, when it is in place, it does give mechanisms and powers that will enable speedy action to be taken. And if the cat and mouse game is what we're going to play, then we're ready for it. And we'll, just as they bring a new product onto the market, we'll be there to gazette it and take it off. And we'll go for as long as it takes to get that pattern established, and then we'll have the long-term legislation in place and a coherent long-term solution to this issue.
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Chair. After all that anticipation,